Hello, and welcome to Introduction to Critical Sports Studies. Today, you will have a shorter PowerPoint presentation here on what is critical sports studies. Tomorrow, you will have on one of your assignments to go over the sociology of sport, a PowerPoint presentation and a lecture that you will have available on day 2. A few of the slides may be similar, but those are just important slides that I want to use to reinforce important concepts with this course that will be important throughout this semester. With critical sports studies, the learning objectives that I would like you to be able to achieve here, first explain what sociologists study about sport. How is sociology of sport knowledge different from information in sports media and everyday life? Why is sociological definition of sport different from official definitions used by high schools and universities? Explain what it means to say that sports are social constructions. Explain why sociology of sport knowledge may be controversial among people associated with sports. What is an ideology, and how are ideologies related to gender, race, social class, and disability connected with sport? Now, I keep mentioning sociology, and I've said at the beginning of this, what is critical sports studies? Well, critical sports studies examines the sociology of sport, the psychology of sport, historical narratives of sport, and really uses this to examine sport and society through many different lenses and intersecting such topics of social class with race, gender, sexual identity, and sport. Key sociological concepts that we'll have to keep in mind throughout this semester are culture and social interaction. Now, culture is the shared ways of life and shared understandings that people develop as they live together. Social interaction, people taking each other into account and, in the process, influencing each other's feelings, thoughts, and actions. A friend of mine who studies ancient Mayan culture once said to me that it's important to understand culture and cultural characteristics because they are the foundations of society. What's important about that statement is that cultural characteristics can differ from society to society. An example of a cultural characteristic is a religion. The dominant religion in U.S. society is Christianity. That may not be so in another region of the world or another country. So that is a cultural characteristic. I use a slide next to identify cultural characteristics that are important to societies, as with the Incan civilization, this image here. When archaeologists, anthropologists, sociologists, historians have gone back and studied these ancient cultures, we find that there are examples of recreation, arts, entertainment, political system, language, religion, and regionality. These characteristics will be unique to each society and different from others. There may be some shared characteristics, yes, but there are usually these set of ideas and understandings of what it means to be from the Incan civilization. That same friend of mine who studies the Mayan culture had made a very funny statement at a conference that I like to share with my students. She said, say the world were to come to an end and hundreds of years from now, maybe thousands of years from now, another alien species were to arrive and want to repopulate our planet. And they walk around what is modern day United States, most likely say Chicago, Illinois, for example. And on each of these city blocks, every now and then they saw these large golden arches. And they'd have to ask themselves, what is that? Was that a religious icon? Was this a place of worship? So no, our society has a large example of a fast food culture. So that example, I think, I provide with a little humor, but that gives you a good example of what it means to have a cultural characteristic. Those golden arches mean something that is unique to maybe our culture and society. But there's resistance to the study of the sociology of sport and critical sports studies. Why? Well, this sociologist Peter Berger in 1963, this quote, it rings so true with the study and my research and what I work with. Quote, "It can be said that the first wisdom of sociology is this: things are not what they seem, unquote. You'll see this example in the study of race and ethnicity in sport later this semester, as well as gender and sexuality. Social constructions that were created to say that one group was more superior than another. Well, that was largely said by dominant white society, early 20th century, of this inferiority of African Americans to the superiority or dominance of white Americans. Those were socially constructed ideas. And by studying them sociologically, we can see that what we thought was true is not. And that is the case with the racial ideology that we will discuss this semester, as well as gender and sexuality, ableist ideology, meritocracy. If we want to look at race, as we do in critical sports studies, it's the most misunderstood and misused and often dangerous concept, I would say, in the modern world. As a concept, as a biological notion, as a social construction, race is largely misunderstood. As a concept, it really is only in the past 200 years that we've started to use the word race to identify differing groups. Used to describe differing human categories. This map here from the 1880s was an ethnographic map from a German encyclopedia. If you click on it or look closely, you will see that certain regions of the world were identified by a race. This is one of the earliest categorizations of this that we can find. You'll see that the European here is shaded as the Caucasian race, but it actually spills over into parts of the Middle East and parts of Asia, what is modern day Middle East and Asia today. That ethnographic map has each group broken down by these categories. Now, the word Caucasian has long been identified with white. When did that take place? What happened? Well, this isn't something that you'll have to know or study for an exam, but just, I think, an important example when studying this. In the 1920s, there was a man by the name of Takao Ozawa. Takao Ozawa applied for citizenship in the United States. In order to do so, you had to be white. Well, Ozawa was from Japan, and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court decided that Ozawa, because he came from what was here in the second category, Mongolian race, was thus not white. They determined that Caucasian was white. 1 year later, in 1924, a man by the name Bhagat Thind from Pakistan applied for citizenship. Pakistan, on this map, found in the Caucasian region, thus he must be white by science, the racial science of the early 20th century, keep in mind. The Supreme Court examined this topic and came out with a ruling that while yes, Thind was from the Caucasian region of the country, because of his very dark complexion, the, quote, common sense rule, unquote, determined he was not white. This was a U.S. Supreme Court within a 12-month period in the 1920s, trying to determine was it science or common sense that determined who was white. Thus, these things are socially constructed. So in this course in critical sports studies, when we're examining race, gender, sexuality, ability, I want you to suspend judgment and think critically about these topics. So when a professor has asked you in the past to think critically, what has she or he said to you are the important characteristics of critical thinking? Well, I put down several steps here in case that is not something that is clear to you what my expectations are. First, I want you to suspend judgment or personal biases to check the validity of a proposition. Second, take multiple perspectives into consideration. Third, implications and consequences of a belief or action, examine those. And fourth, use reason and evidence over feelings and emotions to resolve disagreements. Finally, reevaluate a point of view in light of new information. An example of this is with this topic of the Washington, quote, Redskins football team. There's been controversy of recent years on whether this name of this team should be changed. So in order to really examine this topic, and you will at, I believe, during the third week of this course, we'll examine this much more thoroughly, I would want you to suspend your judgment or personal biases. That might mean someone may have no bias to this or have no concern. There may not even be a football fan or watch the game. But someone might actually be from the Washington, D.C. area, a fan of this sporting team, and thus there might be a personal bias, such as, hey, I was born watching this team. I don't think of this as a derogatory term towards Native Americans. It's just a game. Well, suspend those personal biases. Second, take multiple perspectives into consideration. A recent article came out about 2 years ago in May saying that only 10% of Native Americans are offended by the use of the Washington name. Well, that publication that was by the Washington Post, I believe, interviewed over the phone, anonymously, roughly 500 people that identify in some way as associated with Native American heritage. How current was that research? How in-depth was it? And what did we really know about those people all in the Washington, D.C. area? The University of California, Santa Clara, the University of Minnesota, the University of Chicago, multiple universities have produced many other scholarly examinations of this topic, stating that it is a much larger concern than that. Closer to 70% of Native American people are offended by the term, and even more than that say that it should possibly be changed. Those are scholarly examples that will be found in journal articles and textbooks, but for the average person clicking on ESPN.com, they're going to see, quote, 10% of Native Americans are not concerned with the name, quote unquote, Redskins. Therefore, take multiple perspectives into consideration and understand where your source is coming from. 3, examine implications and consequences of a belief or action. What are those consequences for the Native American community? For self-esteem of young children when they see the likeness of themselves in cartoon figures or stereotypes of savage, violent people. 4th, use reason and evidence over feelings and emotions to resolve your disagreement. You may have had your first ever football experience be at that NFL team's stadium. But do your best to overlook feelings and emotions, to understand and resolve this disagreement. And finally, reevaluate a point of view in light of new information. I'd like to provide a great example of this for myself. Last semester, fall 2016, I showed a documentary that was about race and sport, and it included President Barack Obama. Throughout the talk, President Obama addressed these students at North Carolina A&T University and was talking about athletes in sport, and athletes of color in sport, and athletes of color in sport repeated over and over. And when I realized by the end of this, I had to critically examine this talk to say that what Barack Obama really referred to when he said African American athletes of color in sport, he was really referring to male athletes. There was a very gendered tone of masculinity and straight male in his conversation and in his talk. Myself personally, as a supporter of the president, had to suspend my personal biases and judgment and say, this topic was largely misogynistic. Therefore, that's me reevaluating a point of view in light of new information. When I brought this up with the students in the class, just about every female student in the class rose her hand and said, I thought exactly the same thing. So clearly something the first time I watched it, I did not notice. So sport will reaffirm ideas and beliefs. And the point of critical sports studies is that we can understand these beliefs that people have and that they share and that they interpret to understand the true meaning behind this and understand how we can look at sport in a new way, critically examining what we think we know about sport in order to learn more about what we can learn about our society that we live in today.